important to me, and I see a yes vote in the independence referendum as in some way threatening that identity, then my indecision about it is going to be quite different to the indecision of somebody who wonders whether the NHS can be afforded, whether oil will be a sufficient wealth to carry us onwards in the short to medium term. So I think in some ways just this unified character, this category of the undecided, misses and is much too kind of simplistic for the range of different reasons and sorts of undecided people we might actually find if they are willing to talk to you on their doorsteps.
Mm-hmm. That's also the thing that I think many people perhaps deep down would like to vote yes, but they know they are not likely to be brave enough to do so. Or at least that's what I think at the moment, if we don't give them the arguments for why voting yes is actually okay.
Sorry, just to interrupt, but this is where I think negative campaigning can come in, because I think there's a fair case you could make in many circumstances by saying, you know, if you don't vote for independence, things are going to be worse in the UK, which is a negative thing to say, but I think there is a place for what is essentially a negative take on things at that point.
Yes, I agree. I think there are people who've been told that the UK is functioning absolutely fine, and they're afraid of taking a leap into the unknown if the status quo is absolutely fine. And if they know that the status quo is not fine and that there are more cuts coming and there are going to be many more things happening we don't like and that more devolution is not guaranteed, then they might say, actually, that leap into the unknown is worth taking.
Yeah. That's where I go.
And is there, I mean, to go back to sort of the Stephen Noon type point that he was raising on your podcast this week, that often when we're talking about undecided, it's represented as a question of tone, that you have to avoid being combative because undecided people don't like that. Undecided people want a positivity, because they're not quite the same thing, are they? The kind of the positive statement about why we should do this is one argument for yes, and the other kind of is not to have a combative tone. That seems to kind of fill out this idea of the undecided a bit more. And I think not having a patronizing, condescending tone is absolutely critical when we're talking about things like Britishness, because it's really important for Scottish nationalists to understand that just because they don't feel British, that doesn't mean that much of the population doesn't share their antipathy and will find much a kind of spittle-flecked version of that to be a bit insane. I think that's an important kind of thing about to recognise. But it doesn't necessarily extend in the same direction towards institutions. It doesn't extend to Westminster, Tory politicians, the Labour Party's current instantiation. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think just one last thing in that regard is that it's interesting, I find, from a linguistic point of view, how Better Together seem to be arguing. This is something they don't claim they're arguing for, but if you analyze it, to some extent they're arguing that an independent Scotland would be the right thing it would be a wonderful thing. It's just not safe enough, or it's not prosperous enough. I mean, we're too weak, too stupid, and too poor. But I mean, the way they phrase everything, it's always as if they're saying yes, but they're not saying no. They're not saying an independent Scotland is a bad idea. They're saying, oh, yeah, that sounds okay, but we're too poor, or that sounds great, but we're too stupid, or we're too weak, or something. It's always this yes but campaign instead of the no campaign. It's very, very interesting, because you could imagine a positive no campaign, but that's not what we are seeing, because it would only appeal to 5% of Scots, I guess. The vast majority of no voters are people who deep down would like to see an independent Scotland, but are scared witless.
Yeah, I agree. I've noticed that campaign as well. In fact, I think they should, once it's become clear that their marketing is not going so well, they should rebrand themselves as the Yes But campaign instead of the Better Together. But okay, we need to keep clipping along here because there's quite a lot happened. So whilst we're on the subject of public opinion, there was another poll came out this week, and it was basically saying 2-1 no to yes. But there was a rather good response to it on Scott Goes Pop. I asked him on, but he was unfortunately unable to make it this afternoon, but we'll get him on further down the line. And his basic point was, well, it's a YouGov poll, so it doesn't bother me at all. Thomas, I'll come to you first on that. What did you make of the results of this poll and how YouGov polls tend to be significantly different from others?
Yeah, I totally agree with him, with Scott Goes Pop, that YouGov are always showing really negative, really bad results for the yes side. And this latest poll is completely flat. It's within the margin of error compared to the previous polls. So they're just finding this 29 or whatever it is, 29% yes and 57% no or whatever it is. I've forgotten the exact figure, but something like that. And that's what they're finding every single time. So it must have something to do either with the design of their panel, with the weightings they're applying, or with the way they're asking the question. I mean, they could be asking some questions in advance that they're setting the frame of the UK first, which would sway it, or they might be giving an introduction. I should know because I'm actually on that panel, but I wasn't asked the last question, so I'm not sure what they're asking at the moment, but it's worth looking out for exactly how they're asking it. But it could be the weightings too, because it's well known that they tend to apply Westminster vote weightings, which means they ask people how they voted at the last Westminster election, when of course Labour got a really good result in Scotland, and that's what they're using for making sure they have enough people in each category. I mean, they have enough Labour voters, enough SNP voters, but they basically want 50% Labour voters or something like that, because that's what Labour got in the last Westminster election in Scotland. If they applied Holyrood weightings instead, the result could be rather different, I presume.
Andrew, did you see this poll?
I caught it briefly. I don't have many thoughts on it, to be honest, beyond the fact that, assuming that it's even within the ballpark of the figure, but it is in the country, then it is a wee bit concerning, as always, but it is some way off yet. But there will come a point, I suppose, when that kind of excuses and wriggling ceases to work out. Because, as I've said, I think on this podcast before, when the SNP had its big reversal in 2011, that did start appearing in the polls. It would seem to me quite unlikely that a big groundswell of yes was actually materialising, and yet it didn't turn up in the polls come 6 months down the line, say 6 months.
In the Scott Goes Pop article, he's actually saying that, it did show up in the polls in 2011, but not in the YouGov polls, which is an interesting point.
That's the thing, and if you look at some other polls, if you take panel base who are more favourable to us, and there's no reason to assume that panel base are not any worse than YouGov, it could actually be that panel base are actually spot on here. And if you look at their polls for the past 8 months or so, it does look like the yes side is gaining about 1 point every month or so. So if that continues, we are going to win this.
Yeah, let's hope so.
I mean, just the gap is only 5%. I mean, we only need to gain 5% to win in panel base, and if we are going up by a point every month, or at least every 2 months, we are going to win this. That's what panel base is showing. So we should actually be very optimistic about the polls.
I'd be counter to our Scottish background to be optimistic about anything, I dare say.
But that's the thing. I was born in Scotland, so I can have a different perspective on
it. That's the Nordic horizon, bringing the light from the north, or something like Leslie Riddick likes to say. Well, I don't know. We'll see. They also asked, interestingly, in the poll about whether yes voters were more or less likely to vote no if they thought that more devolution was going to happen. And of course, they didn't ask them, or at least I don't think they asked them, how likely it was that they thought more devolution would be passed. But surprise, surprise, it showed that if devolution was likely, then the yes vote would shrink a wee bit. I don't think that's surprising. I think what's more interesting, maybe from my point of view, is if you ask no voters, would they be more likely to vote yes if they thought there'd be no more devolution? Now, that's another kind of aspect of our undecided picture. This idea that there's a kind of devo middle in Scotland that really wants more devolution and might be frustrated into voting yes in the absence of any concrete proposals from Better Together from the no side. And I don't really know if that's true. It's one of these things which dominates a particular part of the commentary on the debate from folk like Ian McWhirter, Joyce MacMillan, Leslie Riddick, who all happen to have that view, but I'm not sure how much it can really be projected onto the Scottish people.
So I think it's time to move on again to another topic, but it's a little bit removed from what we've been talking about up until now. And Andrew, I noticed you've been blogging quite a lot this week about Bill Walker, who has been convicted. But could you tell us a bit of the background of the story and what's the problem first?
Bill Walker was convicted of 24 counts, 1 of breach of the peace and 23 of assault in the Sheriff Court in Edinburgh. He's due to be sentenced later this month. Summary sheriffs can only sentence people who are tried before them without a jury to 12 months in prison. So basically the Crown Office decided that Walker would merit at most 12 months in prison. Most people who are convicted of domestic abuse don't go to prison, actually, though I suspect most of them aren't convicted of a complaint with 24 charges against 3 different women, as Walker has been. And 4 different women, as Walker has been, because he was also convicted of assaulting his stepdaughter with a pan. This understandably has provoked lots of reaction from politicians, from the media, from ordinary people, saying, well, this guy just can't stay on. He can't stay on in office. The problem is that under the current rules, which are governed by Westminster and Holyrood can't do anything about, you only get disqualified from office automatically. You only lose your seat if you're an MP, if you're jailed for more than a year. So you see the bind here. There's no way for Walker to be sentenced to prison for more than 12 months by the sheriff in Edinburgh, so he won't be excluded from office. Now, this is causing vast consternation and lots of kind of toing and froing and legal speculation, not least from myself, about, well, what can we do to get rid of him, or at least to make his life trickier and ensure he can't just pick up his salary when he's in Barlinnie, or if he is sentenced to a prison term, which as he may not be. So basically, it transpires that there may be an opportunity to remove him of his salary when he's in prison, and I blogged about that this week at the suggestion of Ian Smart, actually, who's been on the podcast before, the Labour lawyer who brought a bit of the Scotland Act to attention, which might be a way for MSPs to take his salary off him when he's in prison. So that's what they're currently exploring, and Tricia Marwick, the presiding officer, has instructed officials in the Parliament to investigate whether it's possible, and they're discussing it at the meeting of the Scottish Parliament's corporate body on Thursday. So it may be that the bastard, if not deprived of his Dunfermline seat, will at least lose his money if and when he gets sentenced to salutary punishment behind bars.
I think it's astonishing that at this point there hasn't been, a dignified or undignified, if you like, resignation. I mean, he's sort of brazening it out. I mean, in such a circumstance, wouldn't even resign to clear his name and then try to come back or something like that. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that he's sort of brazening this out after the conviction. Any thoughts on it, Thomas?
No, I mean, I think it's appalling that we can't do anything, but that's just what happens when you have devolution and not independence. To be honest, that some other parliament is responsible for changing the rules, and to them it's perhaps not such a big case. I don't think there's any doubt that if Holyrood had been the parliament of an independent country, they would just have changed the rules to find a way to chuck him out.
I mean, it's. I think Thomas is entirely right. This does show you, in some ways, the limits of devolution, and there's no way that I can see Westminster introducing anything that can get rid of this guy. I mean, as you said though, Michael, I mean, it's psychologically fascinating, extraordinary, and absolutely horrific to see a guy moments, days, hours, I think, after he'd been I'd been convicted by Sheriff Mackey in Edinburgh. He was popping in, signing his name to parliamentary motions, and you think it's just a sort of an interesting manifestation of absolute denial in the face of reality. And one can only hope that the sort of a short, sharp shock from Sheriff Mackey brings reality brutally into the consciousness of this belligerent man.
It's a sad chapter all round. Speaking of belligerent men, I noticed a comment about Mussolini this week. Which I thought was rather bizarre. James MacMillan suggesting that the National Collective were like Mussolini's cheerleaders. Now, I'm not a historian, but as far as I remember, I can't remember Mussolini actually having cheerleaders with the pom-poms and the short skirts and everything. But what the hell was he on about, Thomas?
I don't know, to be honest. I think it's what that effect you get because I think it's a wider thing. You have all these people who think that the Yes campaign is nationalist, and nationalists are fascists, are people like Mussolini. So anybody who are positive about the Yes campaign must be Mussolini's cheerleaders. And it's so wrong. I mean, when I lived in Denmark, I was a member of a political party that was just the opposite of the Danish People's Party, which is very nationalist. But the thing is that it's completely different things. Nationalism in Scotland is civic nationalism. It's about saying that people who live here should run our own affairs. Whereas nationalism in many other countries is this horrible ethnic thing, the German Blut and Boden and such things, where it's about shocking everybody out who is a bit different. And it's so different what we see in Scotland. So I just find it very, very strange that people can't see that that's not the nationalism we have here. So bring in a parallel to Mussolini is just offensive to everybody in the Yes campaign, as far as I can see it.
Yeah. So Andrew, do you think it's can't see or doesn't look?